Basic jQuery selectors are based on the familiar CSS syntax that you're probably already familiar with, and they work pretty much the same way that CSS does. I've listed here the basic CSS selectors in the table, and you can see they correspond directly to their CSS counterparts. So for example, if I pass a tag name to the jQuery selector, it will find me all elements that have that same tag name. Similarly, if I pass in an identifier, jQuery will find the element that has that ID. The same thing goes for class name. If I pass in a class to the jQuery selector, it will find all the elements that have a class attribute that have that class name. And just like CSS, you can get a little bit more fancy. You can look for tags that have a particular class name, or you can look for a tag that has a specific ID and has a class name on it. And then there's a wildcard character. The special character, the asterisk, basically means find all of the elements on the page. And that sometimes happens. You need to iterate over all of the elements in a page. So let's take a look at how you would use jQuery versus using the plain browser DOM to get at information in a document. So here I have a fairly simple HTML file, and it's been stripped down a bit for purposes of illustration. But you can see it has an unordered list in it and some list items and paragraph tags and so on. So let's take a look at some comparisons of the DOM and jQuery. If I wanted to get all the paragraph tags in the document, using the DOM, I would do something like this. I would use the document.getElementsByTagName and pass in the P, and that would get me all these paragraph tags. To do the same thing using jQuery, you can see all I have to do is call the jQuery object. That's a little $sign right there. That's the global jQuery function. And I simply pass in the parameter P, and that will come back with what is called a matched set, or a wrapped set, it's sometimes called, or matched elements. It comes back with a list of all the tags that match that particular parameter right there. Okay, suppose I wanted to get the tag that had the ID list1 on it. Again, using the DOM, I would use the standard DOM function getElementById, and I would give it the ID, and that's this list right here. That's what the DOM would come back with. Do the same thing in jQuery. You can see I'm just using standard CSS syntax, a little hash mark with the ID in front of it, and that comes back with the element for that ID. Okay, let's get a little more fancy. Suppose you wanted to get all the list item tags that have class A on them. Well, to do that using the DOM, it's a little bit more complicated. You'd have to first use the getElementsByTagName function, right, to get all the LI tags. Then you'd have to write some for loop that would loop through all the results in that array and get the class attribute and compare it to this name right here, A, to see if it should be included in the result set. Well, jQuery does that for you. And again, using CSS syntax, all I have to do is call the jQuery object with this expression right here, list items that have A on them, and it accomplishes the same thing. And finally, let's imagine you wanted to have a situation where you wanted all the tags, regardless of what kind of tag they were, that have a class B on them, but only if they're inside a UL tag. Well, again, using DOM, this would be pretty complicated. You have to get all the tags, see if they have the B class, see if they're inside a UL, that kind of thing. But jQuery makes this really easy, again, using pretty standard CSS syntax with the descendant inside the ancestor. So this basically says, get me everything that has a B class, as long as it's inside a UL. That would come back with these list items right here. In addition to the basic selectors, there's some selectors that are a little bit more advanced. These are the hierarchy and combination selectors. So these allow you to get a little bit more advanced in selecting page content. Basically allow you to select elements based on hierarchical relationships or a combination of criteria. So the first two do just that, whereas in jQuery, usually you'll see one selector passed in. If I passed in a comma delimited list, like, p, comma, div, comma, image, it would find all of the elements that match everything in the list. And for class 1 and class 2, this means find all the elements that have both class 1 and class 2 on them, and they both have to be there. The next couple of examples illustrate hierarchical relationships. So if you wanted to find all the child elements that are direct children of a certain parent, you would use this expression right here. Whereas if all you cared about was finding a tag that appeared anywhere underneath a given ancestor, you'd use this form with the ancestor and then a space and then whatever you were interested in here. And the next two have to do with siblings. So the next operator finds whatever element is next to this element, right, the previous element, and the siblings element says, hey, get me all the sibling elements that come after the previous element right here and match the selector that I'm passing in for siblings. Okay, so let's take a look at some of these in action. I'm going to switch over to the code. Okay, so if you look inside your exercise files, I've got a file right here named basic selectors start, and I'm going to start off there. So I'm going to open this up in my editor. And a couple things we're going to do. So you see that this is pretty much the document we're working with, very similar to the one in the slides. Got an unordered list, got some paragraphs. Let's go back to the source. So what I'm going to do is write a function that executes when the page loads, and I'm going to do that on the document.ready event. Okay, so here's what we're going to do. Document.ready, that's a function. Let's try a couple of examples. So I'm going to say get me the p tags. Now don't pay attention too much to this, what I'm about to do. I want you to focus on the selectors right here. We'll get to this stuff later. I just need to make the results visible so you can see them on the screen. So just bear with me while I do this. I'm just going to make the CSS border a 3-pix solid red line so we can see everything. What this is going to do is select all the paragraph tags. So let's try that out in the browser. And as you can see, all the paragraph tags are now inside bold red outlines. Let's go back to the code, try something else. Okay, let's do the same thing, only this time we're going to do it for everything that has a class of A. So you can see that these list items, that paragraph, those should all be inside red borders. Let's try this. I'm going to refresh. And you can see, sure enough, that's the case. All right, now let's go back and try the ID selector. Back to the code. Okay, so now I'm going to put in list 1, and that's this unordered list right here. So now the list itself should have a border around it. Okay, let's refresh. And sure enough, that works. And then finally, let's try one more. I'm going to try all paragraphs that have class B assigned. All right, let's refresh. And you can see that works just fine. Okay, so let's try some hierarchical ones now. Here we are in the system again, and I'm going to do the same thing. There's a file here called hire combo. I'm going to open that in my editor. Again, follow along with me. We're going to try some hierarchical relationships now. What I'm going to do first is try get me paragraphs and list items that have B applied, and apply that CSS trick so we can see it. Okay, and let's bring this up in the browser. Okay, and you can see that that works, all the paragraphs and everything with a B. All right, let's try the descendant operator. And the descendant operator basically will ask for things inside an unordered list and list items with an A on them. All right, let's try that. Okay, we'll refresh. And you can see that that worked. All right, now let's try the next operator. So we're going to say, get me the paragraph that's next to the unordered list. Refresh. And you can see that the first paragraph that was next to the list is now bordered. Okay, let's try the siblings one. Okay, for this one, I'm going to say, let's see, how about whatever is, let me get the list 1 and get me the paragraph siblings of list 1. So these paragraphs are siblings of list 1. Let's try that. And sure enough, it works. Okay, so now you've seen how to use basic jQuery selectors. Let's move on now to filters.